The Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I are going to analyse the advent of new technologies and the rise of hybrid warfare. Now, in this episode, we will take you on a bit of a journey into a world that exists all around us, no matter where we live. But it's fair to say it's a world that few realise exists and few realise, importantly, how it is affecting them. Now, with the new technologies that surround us, tech that we use every day has become easy for overseas opponents and even enemies to conduct indirect or non-attributable warfare using a variety of means, and Paul is going to take us through all of this. There's also a grey area which Paul refers to as the phenomena where opponent states undermine adversaries from within, sowing distrust or fear where they should not be. The purpose, he says, is to weaken public trust and a population's resolve to support their government. That may sound familiar for many. In the extreme situation, this form of hostilities can escalate into hybrid warfare using indirect and direct means, from cyber offensives to the more serious advent of this, firepower. Now, to illustrate the issue, Paul and I are going to draw on the build-up of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we're also going to evaluate around locations around the world where there is evidence of hybrid warfare. And it might surprise you to realise just how close to home and in the real world examples of hybrid warfare exist. So we're going to cross to Paul very shortly, who's waiting online to dig into this issue. But before we do, if you are joining us via Facebook or YouTube, do feel free to make comments and lodge questions. Remember, if you do so, your interaction may be included in this program. Okay, so let's cross to Paul, who's waiting online right now. Kia ora, Paul. Tēnā koe e ho.
Kia ora, Selwyn, and welcome to the first day of spring in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
The sun has come out, so let's just hope that the warmth continues to arrive. After what was a very, very gray and rainy winter down here in Aotearoa. Yeah, we've got an interesting show today, and by all means, I would second the thought that if listeners have an interest in contributing, and the reason I say this is because this will be more conceptual and theoretical than a lot of our shows. You know, we're not going to do current events today, even though we'll refer our examples. Obviously, we'll refer to real life things. But what I thought I'd do, with your indulgence, Selwyn, is offer, it's not a tutorial or a primer, but a little backdrop to how we got to this notion of hybrid warfare and the gray area phenomena, because it actually has deep roots in the evolution of warfare and its attendant mechanisms such as psychological operations and the like. So let me quickly run down what I think is going on. In the 1990s, the 1990s, when neoliberalism captured the minds of intellectuals and policymakers worldwide. It pushed, free trade as a panacea for underdevelopment and all those sort of things. And we now know that it wasn't quite what it was expected to be, but nevertheless, it pushed an era where, yes, the evolution of trade increased exponentially. Now, that led in the 1990s to the coining of two phrases that are germane to our discussion today. The phrases are intermestic and glocal. That is the combination of international and domestic factors, as well as global and local factors. And from a security strategic standpoint, military planners began to think about the fact that conflict was no longer one or the other. That in fact, a lot of future conflicts would combine to be either intermestic or global. That's the origins of hybridity at the broadest level. We're
Okay,
mixing.
can you just get into those two phrases, and
Sure.
perhaps just explain that out for the average person, and connect the hybrid?
Okay, sure. So, the interesting thing is that, although it was never a black and white, clear cut division between international issues and domestic issues, there's, in fact, in international relations theory, there's a whole literature on something called the second image, which is the domestic sources of foreign policy making. Whether you're democratic or authoritarian, who your constituents are. I mean, here in New Zealand, for example, who dominates our foreign affairs? Actually, farmers, dairy farmers in particular. That is a lobby that sways the foreign affairs of New Zealand in a trade direction. So that's an example of, the domestic sources of foreign policy. Well, so that's been well known. But there was always a clear distinction in traditional diplomacy and in military affairs between the international arena, which, if we go back to Hobbes, is anarchic, it's a state of nature. There is no hegemon, there is no Leviathan. And so it's a free for all, and might makes right. That's where realists come into their forte. And then the domestic arena, which is, in at least with regards to democracies, is, if not Rousseau's meadow, is bound by consensus and compromise and those sort of things. What happened in the 90s is they began to realize that the increasing interdependence of nations on trade began to seep into cultural affairs, diplomatic affairs, in a measure that had never been seen before. I
And
mean, it's always.
this is like the insurance of trade. Is that what you're talking about? Where you might have opposing powers even, but if there's trade dependencies on both sides, there's common ground, and so there's elevated reluctance to actually strike at the other. Is there elements of that in what you're talking about there?
Yes, there is, and very good for you, because that's one of the fundamentals of the liberal order, which I'll mention something about in a second. Because the idea was, yes, with trade will come understanding. With understanding will come an interest in open societies. I mean, it was that whole premise that if you engage authoritarian regimes like the People's Republic of China, they would eventually democratize. Now, that was a false assumption, but that was the operative.
The big word in the 90s being, good governance, etc. Sorry to butt in, but it all fits.
Yeah, no. So, what you see is that although it had always been there, in the 90s, there's this idea that we're increasingly not only interdependent, but where the local stops and the global begins is now gray. It's a very blurred area. It's no longer distinct. And of course, strategists, immediately realized the threat inherent in that gray, which eventually comes to what we know now as gray area phenomena. But the roots go back, quite a ways. What's happened, though, is technology. Technology, in fact, this is considered to be by some scholars, is considered to be either the second or the fourth industrial revolution, however you want to define it. The idea now is we have quantum computing, we have miniaturization of robotics, we have artificial intelligence, we have particle energy, things that are a quantum leap above what we had up until the 1990s. And this makes the extension of both state and non-state actor power deep into the heart of targeted societies much more feasible than ever before. That's the new part, is you can reach out and touch a society, not its elites, but the people themselves, direct and indirectly, in order to influence them one way or another. Well, who glommed onto this first? Well, commercial interests, advertisers. They realize if you can shape consumer preferences, your profit margins are going to go up.
I
So it was
remember
the
reading that. It was about shaping the advertising for the individual. Instead of throwing a blanket kind of generic thing at the mass populations, they'd worked out through tracking, through cookies, through advancements of that technologies that they knew what you wanted to see. So that's what you're talking about, Paul, in a sense.
right. So but again, it was the private sector. So we're harking back to my original remarks about the advent of free trade and globalization, economic globalization, then leading to these other ripple effects. The fact is that the private sector led the charge, if you will, to realize that you can penetrate a society directly. You can bypass its government, you can bypass its border controls, you can go right into the hearts and minds of the people in order to sell a product. Again, we're still with let's make some money on the deal. We're not into geostrategic competition, but that was coming. That was always going to show up. And it showed up in the 2000s, and now it's as you said in the intro, it surrounds us all the time. Well, what is that? Well, this is an extension of what are known as fifth generation warfare concepts. And I'm not going to get into all the other generations, but just think first generation was chucking spears and whacking each other with swords and axes. Third generation was World War II, mechanized warfare on a large scale. We're now into the fifth generation, which is about computing, cyber, all that sort of, remote standoff weapons type of stuff. And what's interesting about it is the hybridity that is spoken of in the strategic circles involves the mixtures of different types of warfare all at once with a continuum, so that you start with what used to be strict psychological operations. Then you add automation. Then you add direct influence, such as we were just talking about. And if need be, but hopefully not, you will engage in kinetic warfare, that is, bullets, fire, if the enemy hasn't already succumbed already. As part of the hybridity, we introduce the gray area. And the gray area is the place where things are non-attributable to a specific party, where things are murky. Is it civilian or is it military? What am I seeing coming at me?
So we saw something like this at Charlottesville, the riots that occurred there early on, and the lead up to the presidency elections with Clinton and Trump. We saw all of this going on, didn't we, in a sense? We've seen it in the months leading up. You can go back quite a long time, but the months leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Earlier back, you roll that back, and we saw the use of cyber attacks through Internet of Things networks to take out the power grid in Estonia for a time. It seemed that was attributed to the actions of the FSB or proxies of within the Russian Federation. So just bringing in a couple of real life kind of things, Paul, just to apply it so that people can see, these things, I remember these things happening. And that's all a part of the more extreme area, but that grey area where while it's happening, you're thinking, well, who's doing this? What is this all about?
I should also point out before I go any further that, you and I have talked at length about the change in the international system from unipolar to multipolar, the transitional moment we're living in, but most importantly, the erosion of norms, international norms. I say that because this has facilitated the rise of the gray area and hybrid phenomena, because there's no clear-cut rules that everybody adheres to anymore, including in warfare. I mean, we've had the reintroduction of chemical weapons. Anyway, it goes on and on. It's just that the breakdown of the international system in this international moment has opened space, again, for state as well as non-state actors to engage in, these murky phenomena. The key here, Selwyn, is that particularly with the gray area phenomena, and you mentioned it well, the whole disinformation campaign in the 2016 US election, the stuff we're seeing here in New Zealand, I mean, again, and they're both quote unquote liberal democracies.
And we
being
refer to as
undermined.
Bannonism type
Exactly.
activities.
I mean, foreign forces that are antithetical to liberal democracy as a political form interfere in New Zealand and interfered in the United States in 2016 and continued to this day, using disinformation, using misinformation, to the point that people don't know where the truth lies, and they're confused. I think that I'm smart enough to realize what's real fake news and what's not. I happen to know that there are biases in the media, as there are biases and prejudices around the world, but they're mostly corporate in capitalist societies. They're not ideological in the sense of, we want to be fascists or whatever. The key here, though, is that these are campaigns that work on undermining or somehow influencing a targeted society, either against its government or in spite of it.
And if some people feel that they get confused in amongst all of this information that's coming, and on top of that, there are also levels in an election campaign in the New Zealand and Australian context with Nation Builder, for example. That technology has been around for quite a few elections now, 2 or 3. It's more sophisticated as we go into the new election cycles, of which it knows, just like when you were making reference to the advertising counterparts, the commercial counterparts here, parties, they know exactly where your sympathies are. They know where your socioeconomic status is by community and individual households. They know all about how to put a message to you to basically sway you a particular way. So there's that kind of persuasion, that kind of, some would say manipulation, but it's also just knowing who their potential constituencies are. And this is a more legitimate form of what you're talking about. So you've got this whole maelstrom of information that is coming out that is basically targeted, isn't it, in a sense, Paul, in the lead up to a planned event by perhaps an adversary or an opponent or an enemy. We see people that would otherwise possibly not engage in direct action suddenly finding themselves a part of some movement that they subscribe to and not really knowing why.
True, and I would say here, we also need to distinguish between misinformation, which is information that is partially true but spun in such a way that it leads to different conclusions than otherwise would obtain, and disinformation, which are outright lies. And those combine, if you work them together in tandem in a campaign, a psychological operation campaign, let's say on social media, people will no longer see the difference between one and the other. And depending on their thrust, can either become disbelievers in what the government says or the media says. That seems to be, let's focus on the media. But think of it this way, Selwyn, and you're more computer literate than I am, so you'll see the danger here. Deep fakes. Deep fakes are right now are state of the art. You can actually put Hillary Clinton eating a baby in a pizza parlor. It will look realistic as, and to the gullible, it'll seem real. And if you spin it, and I'm being facetious here, but the point is, deep fake technology. I mean, that all of these technologies have come into the field of psychological operations, so that it now permeates advertising. It permeates particular, ideological warfare that occurs, as you said, all around us. The key to success in using the gray area as a type of hybrid warfare is what we call the return to sender problem. And it's one that you and I have discussed with regards to nuclear weapons. So long as you cannot identify concretely who the sender was, then you can't retaliate against him. If you're a law-abiding country, see, rogue nations won't care, but they don't target rogue nations. They target liberal democracies. This is mostly coming out of authoritarian regimes who are trying to undermine the liberal democratic order. And they've succeeded. The liberal democratic order, as we knew it in the 90s, is no more. And they're continuing with their onslaught. So the combination of not being able to pinpoint and then retaliate symmetrically, we've also talked in the past about symmetry and asymmetry in warfare. You don't want to overdo it because someone shut down your power plant. You may know that it was the Russians, but if you don't have a capacity to do the same to them, so let's say you're Argentina and you do something to the Russians that they don't like, they condemn them for the invasion of the Ukraine, which, by the way, the Argentines have not. You go and you shut down their power grid. They can't retaliate other than what? Shooting some fishing boat, off the Argentine coast. And that asymmetry in the ability to engage in non-kinetic warfare gives the states that use hybridity and grayness as a weapon a tremendous advantage. And the trouble for liberal democracies is that we're morally and ethically bound not to do so.
Yeah.
We at least we claim. Now, I'm not saying that the United States, the French, the Germans in their day, in the Cold War environment, didn't mess with third world countries, their elections, all that. Yes.
Yeah.
But this is now advanced to the point that you're no longer messing just with elections. You're messing with, the
perceptions.
way
Perceptions.
exactly.
Sorry. Yeah. I was just going to come in on that before we move into examples and perhaps the different events that are created and leading up to, and the strategies and tactics used to get to that particular point. Let's just look at the psychological impacts a little bit more. For example, you brought in the new technologies, how you can basically morph or simulate a realism where some people will think it's real. Other people, even more disturbing, the realism perhaps doesn't matter because they see it. That is real in a sense. That the manipulation of it, the disinformation underlying a particular thing is what's interesting and important as opposed to the real. And perhaps if you get into the layers of that, it's where fiction is meeting fact. In the sense that John le Carre, famous British writer of spy novels, who started off his career as an officer in the MI6 series of the British intelligence community. And he wrote about things, obviously, from that kind of frame. And in one of his books, he makes reference to the theatre of the real and how that was the challenge in the Cold War, to create a theatre of realism where you couldn't tell the perimeters of fact and fiction. What you're talking here is like 21st century, 22 years in, on steroids in a sense of this, where we've gone beyond the not being able to decipher what is fact and fiction, gone beyond the theatre of the real to a point where with some in the communities, the realism element doesn't even matter anymore.
No, I think that's a very good point. It reminds me, anecdotally speaking, I at one point consulted for a leadership analysis group that the CIA had in its organization, and my responsibilities were to do leadership analysis based on my background and experience of revolutionary leaders like the Castro brothers and guerrilla leaders, because there was a lot of hot guerrilla wars during my time in the U.S. intelligence system and the Pentagon. What I found by mixing with that crowd was the CIA has a fleet of psychologists. I mean, a fleet of them. And one of the things that came out of these meetings, again, I'm not a psychologist. I was lucky to be able to be exposed to this. Was they say, look, it's not just a matter of altering reality, for people. What you do is everybody has their trigger points. Everybody has their pressure points. Everybody has their prejudices. And it's all about finding what they are and then exploiting them. So you can look at demographic, statistics and whatnot, and you can see. Well, I'll give you an example. In the United States, one of the populations that is the most averse to vaccination are African Americans, particularly those in the South. Why? Because of the Tuskegee experiments, where white medical practitioners injected syphilis and gonorrhea into African American men and then just watched the effects, just to see what happened in order to develop a cure for white people. That has layered into the historic memory of African Americans, particularly in the American South. So they are incredibly skeptical, justifiably so, when the federal government says you need to get vaccinated. All right? You can exploit that. Anti vaxxers did, in fact, exploit that when COVID emerged in the United States. They targeted those populations, and they weren't part of the CIA psychology team. I mean, these were people just realized we're going. Here in New Zealand, we have, Maori. Maori are rightfully distrustful of a lot of what the government says they're going to do on their behalf. You exploit that. You go after their natural and justifiable distrust, but you layer in all sorts of other, bogus things and ideological agenda-based things. And you create a fundamental, I would say, undermining of trust in what the government does and says. This done on a grand scale, let's say backed by state actors like the Chinese or the Russians, and I say this unafraid of people accusing me of being a bad guy with respect to them, because it's well known they do this, is cost efficient. You see, if you can undermine a society from within, you don't have to fight it from without. And I'll give you an example to show you exactly how this works. One of the greatest dis and misinformation campaigns currently being conducted on Earth is that of the PRC vis-a-vis the people of Taiwan. And it's particularly focused on the Taiwanese youth. And it has many purposes, but the two basic ones are A, convince the Taiwanese youth that they'll either be the same or better off under mainland control, that their material standards of living will not change and may in fact improve because they won't be living under threat anymore. And so B, they should not serve in the Taiwanese military. They should be civilly disobedient. And in the measure that they are able to convince the Taiwanese youth that this is true, then let's just say that the Taiwanese military's got a major problem on its hands from within. They work that 24/7 as we speak. And quite frankly, from the Taiwanese experts that I read, they're making inroads. A lot of Taiwanese kids, I say kids, people under the age of 25, don't really see the point because, China, they're materialistic. Everything seems good. As long as you just oppose them and annoy them, they'll let you be.
And how do governments oppose this? What's the counter operative elements of it?
Well, it's interesting because Taiwan's having a hard time coming up with a counter. You see, if you haven't experienced authoritarianism, let's say under 25 set in Taiwan, they don't even remember Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT regime. These people have lived under democratic conditions. And remember, we've mentioned this before, Taiwan is the most democratic place in Southeast Asia. Many will argue it's more democratic than Japan or Korea. And I have that from people that are experts on Taiwan that I used to consort with in Singapore at the National University. Um, if that is true, and they have no conception of what it's like to live under a one-party authoritarian state that brooks no opposition, no dissent, um, they're in for a steep learning curve in the event that they cave into the PRC's propaganda campaign, marshaled along, again, these lines. What's interesting is the propaganda campaign, the disinformation and misinformation campaign, is gray because it's made to appear from Taiwanese sources. So it'll say, well, so and so says that he's a little skeptical that the threat to Taiwan is as big as the government is saying, and we know the government has some corruption in it. All of this may be false, but it's being passed out as being, alternative media in Taiwan. And they bounce around to the point that the Taiwanese government may be trying to censor them, but they're playing whack-a-mole. They're going after sources that pop up, flood the social media with these sort of claims, and then disappear and pop up later under a different guise.
Now, do you get this? Sorry, Paul. Do you get the same kind of tactic being able to be deployed from non-state actors? For example, we see in Australia, we see in New Zealand some significant changes of the erosion to the trust in democracy in many respects, and we can see that with respect to media and its efforts to actually tidy house and become relevant within the fourth estate type principle areas in some quarters. I mentioned earlier on Bannonism, and you and I have both, and you've led us through previous episodes of this where we've dug deep into really defining Bannonism and Trumpism. But if we look at Bannonism and the abilities to export, that perhaps if we could label it in a crude sense an ideology, but it's not a state actor. It's coming almost like an export of a cultural expression of chaos, and it's lapping in the societies like Australia and New Zealand, and it's significant. It's talked about every day, isn't it, in a sense? So what I'm talking about here is the state actors like the PRC, the global powers, if we like, or world powers, the United States. Some may argue, the Russian Federation has been specific within the perimeters of its influence and being able to totally destabilise to the point where it's able to use firepower as the extension of. But what's the threat from the ideological and the cultural expression of these new hybrid warfare tactics? Is that something that needs state actors to defend and have a counter defence against, a counter operation against?
Well, yes, you do. I mean, let's remember that a lot of times these non-state actors work hand in glove with state actors for a common purpose. And I think that's the case of Bannonism, that we know that he funds and provides platforms for right-wing extremists all over the liberal democratic world, but he in turn has sources of funding that have been traced back to the Russians in particular. He's not as fond of the Chinese for whatever his reasons, but he's definitely not fond of liberal democracy. And I will say this, we've got to pause for a second. The reason a lot of this works in places like New Zealand is the fundamental flaws of liberal democracy in its current form. I mean, we are not immune to corruption. And New Zealand is a relatively clean place, but we are not immune to corruption. Go to Australia, go to the United States. Democracy is in crisis. And it's not because Bannon is manipulating. He's taking advantage of the pre-existing crisis of democracy where it has failed to deliver on its economic and political promises to the majority of the country while trying to safeguard the interests of those who are being left behind. Let's say the people in the Rust Belt in the United States, who are the core of the MAGA movement, they were ignored by successive generations of political elites, both economically and politically. So the fault for the current predicament that liberal democracies find themselves in lies within them more than any external actor. What has happened is external actors like China, Russia, even Iran look at this and say, these countries are weak. These countries are fragile, and we can sow division. We can accentuate the fractures so that we can confront them in the foreign policy arena in a way that we couldn't do before. And that's exactly what the moment we're living in. Exactly. But the confrontation is indirect. And again, it's very hybrid. And the idea is the U.S. cannot retaliate decisively against disinformation operations that undermine faith in the U.S. government because it doesn't rise to the level of formal war. Now, we'll mention the Ukraine in a second. There it gets, it turned into formal war. But the idea is this is a type of warfare. Again, indirect or soft warfare, if it's such a phrase, where you can achieve strategic objectives vis-a-vis a targeted society without firing a shot. In fact, if any shots are fired, they will be done by the targeted society against itself. And a clear case in point was, what was it, over the weekend, Senator Graham, said that if Donald Trump is indicted for, stealing the classified documents, there would be riots in the streets. Whose purposes does that serve? Well, I'd say it serves the Russian purposes really well. Now you've got American politicians talking about rioting because a former president did something terribly illegal. That shows you the impact of these operations, because a lot of what you see in the United States emanated from the disinformation and misinformation campaigns that originated with the the GRU in Russia. GRU is the Signals Intelligence Agency in
like
Russia. And
military
these guys,
intelligence.
yeah, and they know what they're doing. I mean, these guys are expert at psychological operations, and they've got the United States now in a bind because what is the Achilles heel? And again, we've talked about this. If you're an authoritarian and you think of one area of advantage where you can use, the gray and the hybridity to your maximum advantage, it's the fact that in liberal democracies, you have protections, legal protections, and freedoms of speech, of movement, of assembly, of association. All of those to the authoritarian mind are vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And, we see it now.
We see it very clearly that the free speech campaigns of a couple of years ago, where there was legitimate debate relating to the perimeters of free speech, freedom of speech, and those ideals being captured by various groups here in New Zealand and in Australia, I must say once again, to their own chaotic means. And so that's an interesting thing. It's almost like the freedom of speech, freedom of expression campaigns have been hijacked for an ideology of which has no respect and doesn't want free speech in the first place.
Exactly. Again, this may be a crude analogy, but you may recall when Jimmy Carter ordered a rescue mission for the American hostages in Iran in 1980. And that rescue mission involved 6 or 7 helicopters landing in the desert in Iran, and then special forces guys were going to go and somehow save these people. When they got to the desert, the helicopters lifted off an amphibious carrier, got to the desert, and one of them suffered a catastrophic propeller failure, sliced into another one. Anyway, it turned into a debacle. They burned. They saved nobody. It was a disaster that sealed Carter's fate as a president. I say this because the analogy or the parallel to free speech being abused is that those helicopters, while they were on deck, were being washed every day with salt water. The sailors involved were either too dumb or too careless to clean them with fresh water. So they salted them for the month or so it took to get over to the Persian Gulf. And when the helicopters lifted off and were put under stress, they failed because they were corroded. That's the analogy I'm trying to draw, because we have free speech protections, but it is allowing hate speech to emerge under the guise of protected free speech, offensive speech. And we are having a hard time, both in New Zealand but elsewhere, dealing with that. Some of the bad apples here in New Zealand, they are preaching hate and violence, and yet they have protectors, ironically, in the right-wing media for the most part, who say, hey, they can say anything. They're not responsible if someone goes out and puts a machete to, a Maori person or a Muslim person. That's the other guy's fault. And like, no, they're inciting violence on a grand scale. That's different than protected offensive speech. But we've corroded the standard to the point now that a lot of people are confused. I see even in my, just with the school parents at my kids' school who say, well, they don't mean anything. They're just blowing off steam. And I'm like, no, you're targeting for violence specific groups, again, Muslims, as if they were the source of all the problems. Well, they have a right to say so. And I'm like, they don't. That's the point. They don't. If you say, I don't like Muslims, that's fine. Okay, it's offensive, but it's fine. If you start saying, smash them, and that's beyond the pale. We're now all confused. That confusion serves us not at all as a stable democracy, and serves the interests of those who want to undermine us as a democratic society very well. So that's why I'm on record as saying that a lot of these right-wingers who were involved in the Wellington protests and who continue to agitate are both seditious and subversive. They're seditious in their actions and they're subversive in their intent, and they need to be dealt with accordingly. But even the police are reluctant to go after them along those terms. So,
just
anyway,
just on this part of the discussion, there's an element perhaps of, once again, the areas of the perimeters of freedom of speech, hate speech, and the effects over a long term that this takes. What I'm talking about here is there are out of the tragedy of the March 15 massacre at the two mosques in Christchurch. What we can glean out of that is some areas of understanding in exactly what you're talking about here. And it's in a long piece that examined into the details as of this particular mass murder as it went through the courts. I wrote a piece for Cicero magazine in Germany, which is a philosophical, political base type editorial policy to it. I raised the question, at what point is culpability assigned to the guilty party? Is it when the decision is made to pull the trigger? Is it stepping back in the planning of that event that leads to mass murder in the case that I'm referring to here? Or is it where speech that is extreme, that is hate, that is alienating, divisive to the point where it creates targets, where the communities of which within those types of conversations take place becomes the norm and is socially acceptable? Is that where culpability begins? So we're getting, in that philosophical expression or examination, we're getting to the points of the extreme intolerance of a liberal society to curb what may lead the steps toward a mass murder like we saw in Christchurch. And in my mind, that gets down to the challenge of our time. Where does the perimeters, the extremities of hate speech be located or sit within a society that expresses and accepts and celebrates the ideals of freedom? Now, Paul, this is a philosophical question, but it's one that we saw in real time developing on our own shores here, didn't we?
Exactly, and I think that what it invokes is the need to not necessarily redefine, but clarify, demarcate the rights and responsibilities uh, inherent in a liberal democracy. We hear a lot about the rights that we are entitled to, and so, for example, we hear people can say anything so long as they don't hurt someone else. So as if words do not matter. And people forget about the responsibilities. Just like you don't cry fire in a crowded theater, you don't say things that could incite unhinged people to do violence to others. That's part of the rights and responsibilities balance. Right now, we're having a hard time striking that balance. And it's not just New Zealand. I mean, I see the right wingers here constantly barking about free speech, knowing full well that most of them, if they were in power, would censor leftist speech right, left, and center. In the United States, it's almost a hopeless cause. Once Reagan abandoned the fairness doctrine in broadcasting in the 80s, it's led to these editorial angles, especially again in right wing media, that are downright disloyal and treasonous. I mean, Tucker Carlson is a traitor to the United States, and yet he's the most watched cable TV host in the country. And the guy he spews nothing but disinformation and misinformation, a lot of it parroting Russian lines. I mean, it's truly incredible to me to observe this and go, no one can do anything to him because there's no restrictions on editorial opinionizing, even though it's injurious to the collective well-being. So I think we need to, and I wish we had more civics education, quite frankly, in our high schools to redraw, not redefine what it means to live in a democratic society. You have individual rights and responsibilities, you have collective rights and responsibilities. And the balance is struck by not going overboard on any one of them. But right now we're in a case where, because of these hybrid means, these gray what means of influencing people directly, there's this notion out there that anything goes when it comes to speech. If anything bad happens, it's the fault of others who are nutters or whatnot. And that at the end of the day, if someone is the victim of a hate crime, they must have done something like look different or something to that effect. I mean, how many times, Selwyn, did we hear after March 15th unpleasant people on the right say, well, they shouldn't have been here in the first place, right? They shouldn't be in New Zealand in the first place. If they weren't here, they wouldn't have been attacked. I mean, we've moved that far over. So I think that we have quite frankly, I think it's an existential threat to democratic societies. We're living that moment right now. I guess the good news is that not all is well in the authoritarian world. And a lot of what they're doing is, in fact, prompted by their decline as societies or their concerns that their moment in the sun is going to be a brief one. And that, I think, leads to Russia. And Russia's invasion is, to my mind, as we've talked before, a clear sign that they're in decline, and this is the last grasp at empire
Yeah.
because they're going down. They're going
Well,
down now.
certainly what we're seeing illustrates that point that you've made going back 3 years at different junctures in our episodes, that when you've got a declining power, the risk of warfare and all means of which it is able to be expressed as a realism. Let's get to that. Let's talk about all of this within the context of a theatre that is happening right now. I say theatre in the sense of sometimes the English language doesn't quite connect with the realities, does it? But what we're talking about is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, how does all of this play with what we are seeing at the moment, Paul?
Well, what was interesting is that it shows the limits of certain hybridities, in that the Russians, when they first invaded the Donbass and Crimea in 2014, what was noticed there was that what the phenomenon known as the little green men. And what this were groups of soldiers, large groups, formations, operating in a military fashion, clearly, with military discipline, but who were wearing unmarked green uniforms. So there's no insignia, you don't know exactly who they are. And that was designed to disguise the fact that they were Russians. Now, there's good and bad news for the Russians on that. If you don't have insignia, part of the Geneva Convention is that only people who are distinguishable as combatants are afforded the protection of the Geneva Convention. Guerrillas know this all the time. Anyone who's been involved in a guerrilla war wearing various civilian clothes or something that's not a issued uniform know that if you're captured, you're toast. Geneva Convention will not apply. The Russians have decided to take this a little step further. They put these green uniforms on the military in order to mix them in with separatists and militias and irregular forces, but give them some military steel. And they were very successful. Very successful in the Donbass and the Crimea in 2014. They were able to move because the Ukrainians many times weren't sure who they were looking at. Didn't know exactly what they were seeing. This is playing very loose with the rules of war. Now that they've had to go in, they decided to go in a full-fledged way. They've abandoned any pretext of not being Russian. The irony is that they're using the same formations and maneuvers that were used by the Green Men. So now it's pretty obvious who those guys were. However, getting back to hybridity, in the advance into the invasion, let's just think last December into January, the amount of psychological operations, again, disinformation, misinformation. I mean, how many times do we hear references to Nazis and the Azov battalion as if every Ukrainian was a Nazi? How many times did we see doctored videos of atrocities against civilians that it turns out were not committed by Ukrainians, but were committed by the Russians themselves, but had been doctored? This sort of stuff is traditional psychological operations, but taken to the social media world. And remember, we did an episode on open intelligence and how effective that was for the Ukrainians. Well, that's just a subset of a broader picture where both the real and the imaginary are increasingly blurred in the battlefield. The Ukrainians are doing it now. They're putting out videos because there's a lot of captured equipment. The Ukrainians, of course, have been equipped with Russian equipment before the war. And so there's a lot of disguising who's moving what. And quite frankly, coupled with the foreign disinformation campaigns, I think that both you and I have seen in response to some of our shows about the Ukraine, trolls coming in and claiming that we're propagandists for the states or wherever. All of this, what it's designed to do, is sow confusion in the eyes of the West, and therefore undermine public support for the continuation of military support to the Ukraine by NATO and its allies. And in the measure that it's able to carve out spectrums of the Western polity, they might be successful. I mean, an example I'll give you is Brazil is about to have an election next month, and we may talk about it. But the Brazilian left, which supports Lula Ignacio da Silva, who's challenging Jair Bolsonaro, the incumbent, they're pro-Russian. They're pro-Russian.
Some would say in a more covert state, this Bolsonaro is as well.
He likes the authoritarian side. He just likes Putin. Yeah. But the left, and this harks to something we talked about last week, I think, or the week before, which the Brazilian left is pro-Russian because they remember American imperialism.
Yeah.
And they don't care that the Russians are being imperialist. They don't care. They're going to support Russia as if it was the Soviet Union. And so Lula's got a problem on his hands because he's got these tanky types who are a core of his constituency, who are like, openly advocating for a Russian victory. That doesn't sit well with the majority of the Brazilian population. And Bolsonaro's gone quiet about the war. He's just shut up, which is
So,
the better thing to do.
Paul, if we look at all of this and we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you've contextualised that superbly, and thank you for that. Earlier on, we touched on the PRC in Taiwan. What is your sense of a trajectory here? Is it one that will not get to firepower, and that hybrid warfare, in the context of which you detailed relating to Taiwan, will satisfy the needs of China's ambitions and control of that region? Or do you see that it is a potential firepoint, flashpoint, and that this hybrid warfare of what we've witnessed and what you detailed is the precursor to that?
I think it is, but it's thank you for bringing the PRC up, because it reminds me to say, give another example of hybridity, and then talk to your point. The note about hybridity is the Chinese are running civilian drones over Taiwanese territory, not their military airspace, not that military identification, over actual physical, the Taiwanese archipelago has a lot of small islands that usually have small military garrisons on them.
And there was one shot down this week by the Taiwanese, wasn't there?
They tried to shoot them down.
Yeah.
These drones are small, and they're clearly used for reconnaissance, right? They're not armed drones, but they're not military drones. They're civilian drones. Now, they're obviously used in a military fashion by military intelligence, but it poses a conundrum for the Taiwanese, because unless they overfly a military installation and do not heed the warnings to go away, they can't be shot. And, these drones are sophisticated. They can look over, not the horizon, but at a distance to see what's on these installations. So the Taiwanese are in a predicament and now have, in fact, shot at a civilian drone. But that's the operative term. They're civilian drones. You don't want to get into the president of being the precedent of being the first country to shoot down a civilian drone because you think it's looking at you. It'd be another thing if it fired at him. So you've got that on the one scale. You've got the disinformation campaign again, on the Taiwanese youth on the other. The Taiwanese got their hands full with dealing with this. Now, interestingly, about what is going to happen, I think we're going to see a shooting war, but not a big one. You notice that the American congressional delegations have been coming over, and I don't think they're provoking the Chinese, because I don't think that the Chinese have any reason to be provoked, but they sure feel that there is. The United States now is going to offer Taiwan $1.1 billion in military weapons. Big advance over the latest tranche of 2 years ago. Why are they doing this when the Chinese are so upset? Well, I think it's part to show the Chinese that if they try to take Taiwan, the costs are going to be exponential, way out of what they anticipated, because they're seeing, the Americans are seeing the success of all that Western military aid to the Ukraine. That strategic, stalemate that we talked about is a product of all that weapon coming in. I think the Americans are trying to do the same thing. And so the Chinese may do a military probe, to test the defenses. If they can get in, let's say, do an amphibious assault and establish a beachhead, then they may want to press further. But it would be a probe to begin with, because if they can't get in, then they need to talk to the Taiwanese about cutting a deal. And cutting a deal would mean withdrawal of American advisors. There would be, you don't accept some of the weapons the Americans are offering you, and we'll stop bothering you. That sort of thing. So I think what's going on is both sides are playing to use a kinetic moment in order to open space for a negotiated resolution over the short term. I mean, I can't hazard a guess of what's going to happen, in 15 years. But right now that they're in an impasse that makes everybody uncomfortable, I'd rather have, or they would rather have, an impasse where everybody is comfortable with the status quo. And so I think that the United States is bolstering its support in order to demonstrate to the Chinese that any move they make is going to be a very costly one. The Chinese will make the move anyway, but in a limited fashion to test the resolve of the Taiwanese and their military, expertise. And if it turns out that the Taiwanese are up to the task, then I think they're going to start talking again. But in the
Mm.
meanwhile, all of this grayness, it's a big fog out there
Mm.
when it comes to what the Chinese and the Taiwanese are doing, because the Taiwanese are engaged in countermeasures of their own. They can't saturate the mainland with propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation the way the PRC does to them, but they're doing it nevertheless in the coastal regions.
And it's just I'll just touch on a couple of the comments that have come in too, like that are relevant. When we were speaking about Russia, Sharon, for example, based, and think it's good to see Sharon joining us again, all the way from the United States. And she makes a comment. I'll just bring it up on screen for those that are seeing and not just listening, but I'll read it out. Russia is going down, she says, but if the GOP, the Grand Old Party, that's the Republican Party for those that are further afield, gets control of Congress, all bets are off with Ukraine. Now that is ties into the dominance of the MAGA crowd, isn't it, Paul? From the point of view of the primaries that are ongoing at the moment. That's not the same with Taiwan, is it? This is, both sides of the aisle in the Congress seem to be right there supporting Taiwan and such things. So there are differences that are shaping up in various things. I'll just verbally bring in a couple of the comments that go back over the program before we wrap up and give a last word to Paul. And it's been a lively conversation. I encourage those that are listening to join the social media, mainly on YouTube and also Facebook, if they want to continue on that conversation on such things. But when we were talking about the issues of free speech and things sparked up in the commentariat here and that are watching. I'll just bring one up here. There's so many I'm just going through. I should have asterisked them with relevance while they were coming in. I hate to say it, David Mooring says here, I hate to say it, but maybe the only solution is to target the sources of this hate speech. I just put in brackets there myself there, and continuing on with the quote, the leaders of those authoritarian states flooding those countries with effective shame-inducing propaganda, bringing them down. David expands on this a little bit later where he says, perhaps there's a thing where you create a place where some of these leaders and tyrants could be placed. And it kind of brought to mind, Paul, an old Roger Waters lyric when the last album of Pink Floyd, so we're tapping into culture here, obviously, and he made the comment about, the name of the song was The Fletcher Memorial for Incurable Tyrants and Kings and Queens. So the idea has been around for a long time, and what it does, why I raise that, is it underscores this very, very, very important thing of which Paul gave a response to, and it is, where is the levels of hate speech to be contained within the ideals of freedom of speech? And thanks to the commentariat for adding to that. Sharon, also from the United States, she says, freedom of speech has lost its true meaning. When speech is creating murder and chaos, it needs to be reined in. We need rules for what is accepted as free speech. Now, I salute that. I think that's such a sensible comment and one which a whole discussion could be anchored off. Paul, I'll just pass over to you for a last word.
Starting with Sharon, and again, hi Sharon, glad to see you, or at least know you're out there in the ether. The trouble with the free speech arguments is that in any liberal democracy, you're going to find what I know as free speech absolutists. The absolutists believe you can say anything anytime. and it's a matter of individual responsibility for how people react. I disagree. I think free speech is conditional, and it's conditional on the harm that it does to others psychologically as well as physically. And someone here in New Zealand said to me a while back, if you're not going to get up in the middle of Queen Street, that's the main street in Auckland, and say something offensive because you fear that you're going to get your butt kicked, then don't say it online. Don't say it on air. But we have a fair amount of right-wing media commentators here who do just that. And I actually refuse. I get asked for interviews a lot, and I refuse to go on those platforms. I simply will not legitimate. People have now stepped over the threshold from offensive, protected speech to hate speech. The other thing, and this gets to Dave's point, it's going to be hard to target authoritarian leaders because their defenses against the free flow of information are very effective. But we do need to think about symmetry in information warfare, symmetry in psychological operations, whereby somehow the countries that are being targeted by the likes of Russia in the psychological space respond in kind so as to make the point that, again, the costs will be too high. And here's an illustration in a slightly different way. In 2015, the U.S. discovered that the Russians had hacked into the electronic voting systems of several states. South Carolina is the one I remember the best. And so they shut them down. But in August of 2015, how did they put it? The NSA, so the Signals Intelligence Agency of the United States, did something, sent a message to the Russians that did not cripple them, did not really, interrupt normality, but they had a signature on it. They wanted the Russians to know that it was the United States that did this. So let's say they penetrated all the way in to the command and control center of something, and they stopped right there and then put a smiley face and said, regards from DC. What that was designed to do was to tell the Russians, and particularly the GRU, that if you can play this game, we can play it too, and we can play it better. And they stopped. They stopped with all of their election ballot fiddling. And instead, they turned around and focused on Hillary's emails. And they used Julian Assange as the useful fool because they fed him the information about her emails, which again were stolen, and then offered to the Russians. They turned around and gave it to WikiLeaks, and that's how that blew up. Very effective use of, again, useful fools. But the point was the interfering with the ballot was stopped because the United States sent a symmetrical response of an electronic kind, a hacking kind, to let the Russians know, you better stop because we can do this too. I think there's an opportunity to do that to the Russians. I think they're overextended. And what is most amazing is we haven't talked today about the murder of the daughter of Putin's philosopher king.
Is it a black flag operation, do you think? Just on that?
No, I think it's dissident elements in the Russian security apparatus who wanted to bump this guy off, not the daughter, even though was a hyper nationalist, because they think that they can't talk sense to Putin until this guy's around, while this guy's around. The other one who's got to go is the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. You remove those two people as sources of influence on Putin, maybe he'll start listening to pragmatists who say, we got to cut our losses. We got enough territory for the time being. But even that may be too late because now the Ukrainians have launched a counteroffensive. And it looks like that counteroffensive may be effective at breaking that land bridge that we've talked about so much between Mariupol and Crimea. So it is possible that a psychological campaign is being waged as we speak by NATO on the Russians so as to diminish Putin's stature, not in the eyes of the public. They've more or less said on how they see the whole thing, but in the eyes of the security elites, the political class, but most importantly, what were they called? The Slovaki, or the 500 to 800 security officials who back him. And I think that car bombing is an indication that it might be working. No, I don't think it was a black flag per se. It was a dissonant faction, and it definitely was not done by the
And
Ukrainians.
that creates opportunity for opposing forces like the West, in the sense of being able to counter-offensive in such ways of using such groups if there's dissenting organised groups within the, should I say it, Russian Federation regime, as opposed to the Russian people. So, Paul, let's wrap this up. Once again, Paul and I will be back with a episode of A View from Afar in a few weeks. We're being a little bit vague about as to exactly when, and that's because of moves on my part, and also from the point of view of Paul. He's got some things that are coming. And we will be back once again, energised with the current affairs element, and also looking deeper under the hood of what is really driving such things. And, we can loosely call it theoretical. That's the oscillation that we do. So, thank you for being with us, to those who joined us live, and also to those that will be listening to this on demand. We appreciate your time and your effort there too. We hope that the series so far this year, of which has been 19 episodes, has been meaningful. And if you do miss an episode, look back on YouTube in particular and look for a subject that might tweak your interest in those weeks when we're not here. Until we're back, take care out there. Keep your antennae up for exactly the kind of things that Paul and I have been talking about today. And we look forward to your company once again in the near future. Until then, take care. Ka kite anō.